So, welcome everyone to our Musings and Echoes. We're going to walk the talk, or talk the walk, is it? It's talking the walk. We're in the seventh Sunday after the Epiphany, and today I'm going to do this a little backwards. We're going to read the Gospel reading first, and then I'm going to go back to the Scriptures as Jesus knew them. We'll look at the Torah, or the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and then we'll get a little bit of Paul's reflections following on that. So we have Ollie and Jada who'll be participating today. So this is our first reading then is taken from the First Nations version of the Scripture. We're picking up the story from last week, blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew, and in Luke's Gospel, blessed are the poor. He just goes straight to it. So we're in this opening sermon of Jesus, what we call the Sermon on the Mount in one Gospel, or the Sermon on the Plain, the way we hear it in Luke's Gospel. So let's see how we hear this. So Jesus is speaking to the crowds. He's talking about the way we treat our enemies. Hear me, you who are listening now. I'm telling you to love your enemies and to do good to the ones who look down on you, returning blessing for cursing. And send up good prayers for the ones who give you trouble and pain. If someone slaps you on the side of your face, show the strength of your heart and offer the other side. In the same way, if a thief takes your coat, offer them your shirt as well. When someone in need asks, don't hold back. Do what you can to help. If someone takes what is yours, let them keep it. Here's another way to see what I'm saying. Help others in the same way you would want them to help you. Where is the honor in only showing love to the ones who do the same for you? Why should you be given respect for doing good to the ones who do you good, or for lending only to the ones who can actually repay you? Even tribal tax collectors and outcasts do these things. Instead, show love and respect to your enemies. Help them when they're in need without asking them to repay you. This will show that you are children of your Father from above, for He is kind and takes pity on the ones with bad hearts, even when they do not thank Him for it. So then, show kindness to others in the same way as your Father, the Great Spirit, does that. Don't pass judgment on others, and you won't be judged either. When you release others from their wrongdoings, you will be released from yours. The amount you measure out to others is the amount that comes back. Just like a basket that has been filled to the top, shaken down and packed together until it overflows. What you give out will come back to you, full circle. So that's our gospel reading from Jesus today. Just like to introduce a few of our symbols here. You see I've got a raven, a little origami raven, a paper raven with us today. That raven is the trickster figure, of course, in many of the mythologies of the First Nations of Turtle Island, and is kind of playing games with us to get at stuff from underneath get at truth sideways through stories. And interestingly, we've got a trickster figure. Here I've got my scrolls, my sort of simulations of the ancient scrolls which Jesus would have dealt with in his synagogue. And so we're going to go back to one of those very first Torah scrolls, right back to the beginning, to the Genesis story. And one of the trickster figures, the biggest trickster figure, is Jacob. He's the deceiver. And of course he has a large family. And that family runs into trouble. It runs into trouble because there's a bit of favoritism going on. I don't know if you've ever seen that in a family, but it can be really deadly when parents start to play favorites, or when one family member thinks they're more significant than others. So we're going to hear a little bit of that complexity today, and we're going to go to the Joseph story. So let's hear a little bit from, Jada's going to read us a little piece of that. No, the other way around. Sorry. Holly's going to read us that.
A reading from Genesis. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty.' Hear what the Spirit is saying to the gathering. Thanks be to God."
Our psalm response comes from Psalm 37. I'm going to choose one verse. We're going to sing it today, or I'll sing it. I'm going to sing it in the Hebrew. So I'm just choosing one verse which connects to the Joseph story, Psalm 37, verse 5. And here's the tune. I'm going to invite you to sing, if you like, Die, Die, Die. And it goes like this. Die, 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 do it again if you like. Die, 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 Now, for those of us who are not fluent in ancient Hebrew from thousands of years ago, those words, putting them into English, look something like this. Roll, Gol al Adonai, roll onto the Holy One, your pathway forwards, which is how you live or what you're going to do next. In other words, we're all walking out into the unknown, kind of like Joseph. And so the invitation, King David playing his guitar, comes up with this song. He says, why don't you, with the pathway that lies ahead of you, that unknown path, just roll the whole thing onto the Holy One. Vehu ya'aseh, and God will take care of it for you. Trust in God. Uvtachalav, trust in the Holy One. Vehu ya'aseh, and God will just take care of it. So that song speaks to me a little bit. I'm trying to imagine Jesus using that week by week, and I'm trying to imagine Joseph in the story also being invited to experience that. Of course, David comes later than Joseph, but the same invitation to trust that applies to our lives as well. Now, we've got one more reading to do before we delve a little bit further and deeper into forgiveness. And this will show us a before and after of another kind. St. Paul is talking to the Christian community in Corinth, and he's laying out the central point of Christian faith regarding the resurrection of Jesus and how that relates to us. So he kind of gives us a before and after. So we're going to hear that now from Jada.
A reflection from the letter to the Christians in Corinth. Some skeptic is sure to ask, show me how resurrection works. Give me a diagram, draw me a picture. What does this resurrection body look like? If you look at this question closely, you realize how absurd it is. There are no diagrams for this kind of thing. We do have a parallel experience in gardening. You plant a dead seed, soon there is a flourishing plant. There is no visual likeness between seed and plant. You could never guess what a tomato would look like by looking at a tomato seed. What we plant in the soil and what grows out of it don't look anything alike. The dead body that we bury in the ground and the resurrection body that comes from it will be dramatically different. This image of planting a dead seed and raising a live plant is a mere sketch at best. But perhaps it will help in approaching the mystery of the resurrection body. But only if you keep in mind that when we're raised for good, alive forever. The corpse that's planted is no beauty, but when it's raised, it's glorious. Put in the ground weak, it comes up powerful. The seed sown is natural, the seed grown is supernatural. Same seed, same body, but what a difference from when it goes down in physical mortality to when it is raised up in spiritual immortality. We follow this sequence in Scripture. The first Adam received life, the last Adam is a life-giving spirit. Physical life comes first, then spiritual. A firm base shaped from the earth, a final completion coming out of heaven. The first man was made out of earth, and people since then are earthy. The second man was made out of heaven, and people now can be heavenly. In the same way that we've worked from our earthly origins, let's embrace our heavenly ends. I need to emphasize, friends, that our natural earthly lives don't in themselves lead us by their very nature into the kingdom of God. Their very nature is to die, so how could they naturally end up in the life kingdom? Hear what the Spirit is saying to the gathering. Thanks be to God.
I love that translation. It just brings it really alive for me to look at that seed image, which we're just getting to that time of the year in this part of the world where those seeds are starting to, we've got primulas coming out, we've got seeds pushing the ground, we've got a little bit of sign of spring not far away. So this concept of our spiritual, our natural and our supernatural, if you like, sense of being is what Paul is talking about. And I'd like to focus today, it's a fantastic topic, the resurrection, the strangeness and weirdness of having something that is unrecognizably new and yet having some continuity, that this is what is the promise of the resurrection, that the risen Jesus is indeed embodied and yet also of another order altogether. And that somehow we, in all of our decayed mortality and weakness, can look forward in that same train to something which is beyond anything we can know as the seed that falls into the ground. What I want to focus on today is a different kind of before and after, a different kind of resurrection that occurs within this lifetime, and that is the forgiveness piece that Jesus makes so relevant. I mean, some people estimate that if you look at 75% of everything that Jesus taught and said, with every parable, teaching, wisdom saying, at least 75% of it is about forgiveness. And forgiveness is about this idea of going from the clenched fist to the open hand, that the thing we're holding on to, which is usually some kind of resentment, anger, or process of that we're in the middle of. Somebody's hurt us, and our instinct is to get back at them, and so we have enemies. And Jesus just speaks right into that and comes up with this, kind of weird wisdom saying, love your enemies. Now, this is not according to our normal pattern of everyday thinking. Good boundaries mean we know who our friends are and we know who our enemies are. Sadly and tragically, as in the Joseph story, sometimes the enemies are from within. So there's a family breakdown with the Joseph story. He's the dreamer. My mother used to call me the dreamer sometimes, like just imagining things. Not quite, hello, I asked you to do that 3 times. I'm sorry, I wasn't even aware. But he's the dreamer, and he has this really awkward dream that he imagines that he's going to be ruling over his own brothers. It's like, whoa. The way to be unpopular immediately is to imagine that you're more important than your siblings. And that isn't helped in the family dynamics when the parents get involved in the same way. So I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but this is where we can go to the forgiveness story, not just as a conceptual idea. Jesus presents it, in a sense, as an impossible commandment. But let's go back to Joseph, who's the one who is, if we can use the seed imagery, he is thrown into the ground. And he's done, it's a kind of act of attempted murder on the part of his brothers, out of their jealousy, rage, and anger. That's just, and they're thinking of killing him, and the eldest brother says, no, maybe we just step back one stage from there. It wouldn't be bad if he was sold into slavery or something instead. So he ends up in this place in Egypt where his own turnaround, the thing that fulfills his dream, is that he gets to be significant in the house of the Pharaoh. He's sort of like the prime minister of the country, if you want. It's a really, really big position. And many years pass. So one of the first principles of forgiveness is that you can't just forgive on a dime. I mean, you can say words, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the transaction has occurred when you've been hurt. Like if I forget something and I apologize to the person, I'm probably, like last week I forgot to be present to somebody's appointment who was waiting to see me. I was really embarrassed. I apologized profusely, and but in 5 years' time, will she and I still be hanging on to that with deep resentments and anger in it? No, probably not. We were able to close that gap fairly quickly with goodwill, explanations, understanding. But if your brother tries to kill you, you just say, oh, no problem, I forgive you. And is that credible if you did? Not quite so much. One of the interesting things that comes up in a book on forgiveness by the Lynns, Sheila, Dennis, and Matthew Lynn, have a book entitled Don't Forgive Too Quickly. And they describe the forgiveness experience in the same way as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross describes the 5 stages of grief. And that is, if you lose someone you love or something you love very closely and deeply, you don't just go from zero to acceptance. Oh, somebody I love died. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear it. I feel angry today, tomorrow I'm bargaining, the next day I'm depressed, and by day 5 I've accepted it and I can get on with my life. Well, no, it's not like that. There is no linear, simple, one-step progression. So we have to understand when we come to Joseph's story of embracing his brothers, when he's the one with all the power and they're all starving elsewhere, Egypt has the grain. They're the kind of breadbasket of the area. The Nile River feeds the plains and they have food. And of course he gets this message, 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of drought. So make sure, good practice, put in store what you need for when the supply chain is going to be broken. Have you heard that word supply chain around recently? We all know we have border crossings that are sometimes closed and goods that are either sitting out at sea in containers or goods that are in a truck and not going anywhere. And I've been in stores recently with relatively empty shelves. This supply chain matters. It really does. And in Joseph's day, supply chain meant put in store now because the time is coming when there will not be. And in that context, his father and his brothers, still living far away, travel to where the food is. However, what they don't know, having abandoned their brother, is what's going to happen next. And they realize they are now the vulnerable ones, put in front of the one who has the power, significant power, to evoke Emergencies Act and actually imprison them, kill them. This is payback opportunity number 1, and they are scared spitless over that. So what we see, the amazing thing though, is by the end of our little story there, that he is weeping and embracing them and saying, come on down, we have the food. I'm going to make space for the whole family. You're all welcome here. Now, this is, remember, there's been 7 years of plenty and 2 years so far of famine before we get to this story, and there's a whole bunch of years intervening as well, where they have no contact, they have no idea of each other's life and whereabouts. So it's a truly broken family. And Joseph is the one who takes the initiative, the one who is the Jesus sermon figure here. That even though he has the position of superior power, he puts that aside in favor of the health and well-being of his whole blood family, all the ones who tried to do him harm. And there's the weeping and the embracing and the loving and the caring. That forgiveness or love in action, forgiveness in action, is not just words here, but it's an actual restoring. Or as Jesus in the last image says, your basket will be full, pressed down, complete measure, and running over. So the brothers who fear that what they did so wrongly all these years before, that could come back to cost them their own lives, which would be a form of justice. You try to kill me, you'll see what happens next. That gets turned around at this ethical level into this abundance of life where everybody wins. So Joseph wins for himself because he's free from the burden of hating his brothers. And the brothers win because they are free from the burden of fear, shame, guilt. That all that was driven through their jealousy, anger, and hatred that led them to cause harm can now be restored to them, so that they not only have their lives, not only are they not in prison, but they are actually given abundance and food in an environment where they could otherwise starve to death, never mind being put in prison. So we come to this question of how does this process of forgiveness work? One of the strangest sayings of Jesus is this idea, and I think there's nothing more misquoted and misused in the whole of Jesus' first sermon than this phrase, turn the other cheek. So we got a slightly different translation, which brings us a little closer here. I don't know, what does turn the other cheek mean to you? If I said it as a sort of proverb in English, how does that come over to you as the first thought? I know. I can fill in the blanks, but anyone can if you want to. If you hear the phrase, oh, I turned the other cheek, what would that mean to you if you were to put that in other words?
Let it go.
Just let it go, yeah. So that's, I think the essence of it is, first of all, it means either let it go, or, and this is the even harder part of it, for those who've been abused in a relationship, we've often used that phrase to mean just be a doormat. Just let someone else hit you a second time. If someone hits you once, just, cringe, cower, lie down, and let them hit you again, which is a disastrous ethic for any situation, isn't it? Do we hate ourselves so much that we just let someone steamroller over us? So we need to come to terms with that phrase. And one of the ways that Walter Wink is a great theologian, rest in peace, Walter, he just died very recently. And he wrote a book called Engaging the Powers. He's a Methodist preacher and theologian who's looking at the concepts of nonviolence and peace and forgiveness through the lens of Scripture and applying them today to our lives. And he looks at this particular verse, and he looks at the way in which this loving of the enemies, or pathway of nonviolence or peacemaking, might work. So in his image of the turning the other cheek, what he is saying, and we get a little bit of this in the translation I gave you, is you actually stand your ground. That's the first step of turning the other cheek, is that you stay the course. Let me just see if I can read that again the way we heard it in this. If someone slaps you on the side of your face, show the strength of your heart and offer the other side. Now, in the ancient world, you have, in Jesus' society, you have 98% of the population are peasant, servant level, subsistence farmers who have almost nothing. They live day to day. There are a small class of owners. This is not like a large middle class society where everyone drives a car and has a house and so forth. This is a place where there is a strong upstairs, downstairs relationship in society. And abusive masters, it was written into Roman law. If you owned property, if you are the father of the family, you have what in Roman law is called usus et abusus, use and abuse of your wife, children, and all property. People are property, land is property, and you can do what you like with it because you are the owner and master of it all. So people then are degraded into this lower position. So if you're a master with a slave or a servant and you wish to demean them, what you can do is just use the back of your hand. Now, one of the ways that Linz put this, Matthew Linz, talks about your left hand is your unclean hand in the time. Sorry, I know we've got some left-handers in here, so this just emphasizes the point. Another layer of the way in which we don't only have patriarchy in the culture that we're dealing with, that we have this preferential orientation towards the right hand. And so if you are an abusive master, you don't use your left hand, it's unclean. Your right hand is used for clean purposes. Your left hand is used for anything from toileting to I mean, that's how literally unclean it is. So, and if you want to treat someone as an unequal, you slap them with the back of your hand like this. You just dismiss them. And Jesus says, when someone does that to you, if they're right at the back of their hand, which is, if you treat someone as an equal, you offer them a fist fight, okay? if I disagree with you and we're going to fight over it, Marcus of Queensbury rules, let's have a straight up fight that's equal. But there's no equality in this relationship, so the master strikes the slave with the back of your powerful hand. So if you imagine that coming on your right cheek, you could choose to do the cowering, self-hatred thing of saying, I am a nobody, and I will just crawl on the ground, and you can kick me if you like. You can do anything with me. I am your slave. You are my master. And Jesus says, here's what love your enemy looks like. In this situation, your master is the one who's claiming power over you, authority they claim to be greater than you. So, first of all, just stand firm. Just stand there. Because then you're actually on the same level as them. You're not backing off. You're not falling on the ground. You're actually standing firm. When someone hits you, stand your ground. It's like, whoa, that is not what we have taken away from this. So let's think about this seriously. And then if you turn and offer them the other cheek, okay? You are forcing them to then say, okay, you're going to use your unclean hand to hit me now? Are you willing to treat me as an equal? So Walter Wink talks about the two hands. I can't do this with a microphone in my hand, but it's like this. The two hands of non-violence, or the two hands of peacemaking and forgiveness, are that one of your hands is there to de-escalate. This is the praying position as well in many traditional religions and spiritual practices, called the Oran's position. But it's the place of equality to the person opposite and facing you. So one hand is there to de-escalate and bring down the temperature. And the other hand is there to bring your own dignity. In a sense, you are removing by standing your ground and turning in the other direction. You're not accepting the put down that comes in the slap on your face. You're still there. You're still looking this other person in the eye as your equal, not as your superior. And you're asking and inviting them to step down from their position of superiority as you bring yourself up to the same place. If we're going to disagree, we disagree as equals. Now, the forgiveness part of that. So the first step in this loving of our enemies is that no one is either greater or lesser than anyone. This past weekend I was at the funeral for Remy DeRoe, who's worked with me for many years in his later life, 97 years old, and the last surviving bishop of the Second Vatican Council. One of the reasons I use Hebrew scripture and work with rabbis is because of the work of the Second Vatican Council, which opened us to say that all of the traditions of the world and all of the Christian and other religions all have things to share and learn from each other as equals. That we are brothers and sisters and friends more than we are just separate beings who continue to look down on each other or treat each other as heretics and wrong. So he was part of that turning around within the Roman Catholic Church that affected the whole world, and it brought us closer together in so many ways. But one of the many lessons of that Vatican Council is how religions treat each other. And we've made, of course, we still have a world of division, but we have made so many amazing steps to do things that we could never do. Now, there's another piece in that story, and it's just gone right out of my mind. Remember, we are in the moment here, so when it comes back to me, I'll get it. But there's a piece to do with Remy and forgiveness that came out of the funeral last week. Yes, the Cardinal, Pope Francis sent Cardinal Czerny to give a eulogy and a sermon as part of the address, which was an amazing honoring, really, and affirming of Remy's orientation towards preserving the fruits of Vatican II into today's world. And one of the things, Remy was the first human rights commissioner for BC. He was appointed by the Premier to this position in the 1970s. One of the reasons he was so, and one of the reasons that the Cardinal referenced in his funeral sermon and eulogy, is that Remy would go out on a limb to protect the baptismal and human dignity and equality of men and women. Now, he didn't stop there. There were all kinds of other inclusions that he practiced. But in particular, in his speaking to the church, he said, "Church, wake up. We need to respect the fact that we need to move towards having married priests, having women are brought up into ministry and no longer put down." And at the level of society in general, he applied the same logic, that this idea of inequality of being needs to be challenged, and it needs to be challenged at every level. And Remy gave his life and ministry within the Roman Catholic Church and within Canadian society to elevating those who had been put in this lower down position. And so, in a sense, his ministry was to offer the other cheek. It was to stand his ground to those who would insist on some kind of false hierarchy of being, some kind of excessive dignity that somehow if you have more money, you have the right gender, you have the right power, whatever, that you can then lord it over other people. And Jesus addresses that very question. Now, peacemaking is a dangerous task, because contained in the being hurt, contained in the being made lower, in whatever our experience is all our own hurt and anger. And it's so easy to work from the place of ego. It's so easy to fight back in the same manner as we have been treated. So Jesus did not say, when your master slaps you on the cheek, stand up and slap him one back, okay? Now, we've probably had that feeling if we're honest. We want to give the same as we got. And Jesus turns us. This puts our own ego on the spotlight. That if we do that, we are simply continuing the same problem. It doesn't actually matter whether the violence comes from below or the violence comes from above in that context, because it's still violence. It's still the clenched fist. It's still the non-forgiveness which is blocking the pathway forward. So Jesus outlines this impossible task, and perhaps the way through is through stories. That the story of Joseph is the story of our life, because not one of us makes it from the beginning to the end of our lives without being hurt. And sometimes, not just in the way of, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show up last week. But what happens when someone hurts you at a much, much deeper level and deprives you of your job, your income, your family life? What happens when your spouse leaves you? What happens when someone shafts you at work and you lose that promotion or you lose the job altogether? Then we're in a different world. And this is where we go deep down inside. And this is where we take the stories with us. And perhaps, like Jesus and Joseph, perhaps we come to the Psalm sometimes. Roll your burden upon God, or the unknown pathway forward in front of you, which in Joseph's case led all the way to Egypt. But it was also the pathway not only to power, but it was in the end the pathway to forgiveness. To trust that in the midst of our pain and misery, if we stand for the dignity of both parties in the dispute, if we use one hand to de-escalate and another to act as an equal in dignity, that we will begin the process of transformation. A process that will be as deep and as amazing as when you put a seed in the ground and something coded into that is wanting, under the right circumstances, to flourish and grow into something amazingly new. And this is the resurrection that we call forgiveness. That something which is buried painfully, deeply, a hurt which we can no longer soothe, we can't just wish it away, we can't fix it ourselves, we can't solve our own anger, our own rage, our own desire for revenge. That when that is buried deep and converted in the process of forgiveness, that as our hand opens up, just as beautifully as the unfurling of a leaf and a flower in springtime, that when our heart opens up to the day when, like Joseph, we can see our murderous brothers fall down on our knees, weep, embrace them, and invite them into our own homes. That something has flourished in our hearts that has changed the world. That we are no longer enemies. The loving of our enemies is the loving of the world into its healing. The standing on the dignity of our own being as well as the dignity of our opponent allows us to engage in a process which will unfold, sometimes only over time. I was with a group today just a couple of hours ago, and people were sharing at a very deep level, I don't need to say who, of course, about the ways in which they had both been hurt and found healing. And it was all about this healing the world through love in action. And it's the love of the enemy, the love of the opponent, the love of the thing that we most fear and don't want to look at, and even the things that we don't want to look at in ourselves, that are the pathway of opening up into a world of abundance, where the end result, says Jesus, is that what we give out will really, in fact, come back to us. Sounds a bit like karma in some of the Eastern philosophies and religion. If you keep on emitting that secret violence or secret hatred or rejection of another human being, that they will sense it. And in some ways, whether they give it back to you directly, you'll keep on in that circle. Forgiveness, the open hand, breaks the circle, so that what comes in its place is something, the full circle that happens, that what comes back to you is that when you practice the ethic of Jesus, when you practice the love that takes care of what the other most needs, not just what you want to put on them in your ego state, but when you do to others as you would wish in your best self to receive for yourself, that will find its way back to you. And it may take 3 months, and it may take 5 years, and there is no logic or specific timing to how these things happen. But the miracle of the resurrection that we call forgiveness is the unfolding of our hands, and the opening of our hearts, and the standing of our ground with dignity, de-escalating and affirming both parties can bring us to this place of true abundance in the end. Full measure, the complete fullness of our being, the divine being within us, poured in, pressed down, and still filling up when pressed down. And even when it's full up, not finished then, because the blessings spill over so that there is more for all. We all win when we all forgive. Love your enemies.